Like one of the things that's often missing from the literature on social capital is that a lot of the opportunities for social action come from knowing about other people, not necessarily by having trust or reciprocity, and those things are obviously important as well, but the opportunities often stem from simply knowing. So, for example, I'm a software developer. I've been doing that for years as a bit of a hobby, and I'm quite good at it. You didn't know that about me, I assume, until now. But now that you do know, there's opportunities could arise where I could help you with something. And similarly, if when I find more out about you, then similarly we can identify opportunities where I might be able to benefit from something and we might be able to act together on something. And so a lot of the opportunities come from knowing. And if we don't know about other people, then we don't know how we could work together and how we might be able to tap into each other's expertise and knowledge. And it's something that organizations are kind of aware of, but it's something they could do a lot better.
Hello and welcome to Rediscovering Connection with me, Shelley Doyle. Before I delve in and introduce you to my guest today, I would just like to share a little bit about why this conversation is happening 2 weeks later than it was intended to. So a couple of weeks ago, I received a telephone call to ask if I would be willing to do a talk at a TEDx Salon the following day. So I literally took a bath that night, determined not to use AI to draft my 3-minute talk, which is all the time I had. I sat down literally at the 11th hour and wrote out my 3-minute script in one burst. Of course, the next day I kind of fine-tuned it a little bit before I took to the stage that evening. And then I had a panel Q&A. So this was kind of one of the really deep insights that came from my master's research that I shared. And the idea of a TEDx Salon, it's kind of a bit of a pulse check to see what ideas they want to nurture for next year. So I have been encouraged to apply for next year, so who knows, we'll see. But yes, this is why this conversation is a couple of weeks later. One of the amazing quote I heard yesterday was from a Canadian BMX rider named Molly Simpson, and she said, "Pressure is a privilege." I believe that quote actually came from Billie Jean King, an American tennis player. But I thought, oh, that's so beautiful because there's so many things that has happened this year that have been high pressure, and what a privilege to have that pressure and have people believe in your abilities to perform under undue pressure. So here we are, 2 weeks later, and I'm very honoured to be joined in conversation with Tristan Claridge. Tristan is the founder and president of the International Social Capital Association, widely recognised as a leading thinker and educator in the field of social capital. He has a social capital conference brewing coming up in March 2026 in Dubai, headlined, I believe, by Robert Putnam. So welcome, Tristan. Thank you so much for making the time and patience for being with me today. I would love, if you are willing, for us to time travel back a little bit and think about what really drove you to come into the field of social capital. What really piqued your curiosity? Because you have dedicated so much time and energy to this topic. So if you're willing, I would love to go a little bit further back with you until we come to present day.
Yeah, sure thing. And thanks, Shelley. It's great to be with you and being able to talk about this really important topics. We need to go back about 25 years. And originally, I was an environmental scientist and interested in sustainability. And as I was doing my undergraduate, I fairly quickly discovered that we actually know a lot about the environment and what we're doing to it and the problems. But what we don't seem to understand quite as much is our relationship with the environment. And so it's more of a social issue or a political issue than it is actually an environmental issue. So I became much more interested in the social side. And by the time I was doing my postgraduate studies, I was interested in why some groups were much more effective than other groups. And I started to be aware of this concept of social capital, which explains perhaps why some people are able to activate and mobilize their connections to be able to achieve things, to be able to work together in collective action. And so that was making some groups really effective while others didn't quite have the same level of social capital. But I was very interested in the theory. And so ever since, I've been trying to make sense of this complex theory, because really what social capital is all about is the reasons why people do the things that they do, how they relate and work to and act towards others. And that's, of course, is incredibly complex. And so I've been working on the theory and helping other people to understand that theory and then applying it to various contexts in many places around the world.
And you do quite a lot of traveling. Am I right in thinking you're based in Australia these days?
Yes, that's correct. I'm living in Australia and do quite a lot of travel. I've been to, I think, 20 something countries so far this year.
This year? Oh my goodness. Wow. Okay. So, and where does the Social Capital Conference in Dubai kind of fit into your plans? Is this part of a global travel plan next year?
Yeah, the conference really is a coming together of the global field of social capital, which I think has been a long time coming. There have been some international gatherings in the past, but it's been over 20 years since the last one. And from my own personal perspective, I've been building the field of social capital for 20 years and increasingly connected with people all around the world. And that eventually led to the formation of the International Association. And ever since we formed the association, we wanted to get together in person and hold a conference because, of course, that's the best opportunity to be able to meet people, to collaborate, to discuss and have these important conversations. We hold weekly webinars, but that's a quite a narrow kind of format for engaging in those kinds of conversations. And so the conference is something that we've been working towards since we formed the association. And we're finally able to hold it. And fortunately, we've had an enormous response. I think nearly 500 abstracts have been submitted, and we're expecting a really great turnout in Dubai.
Well, I, for one, am very excited. I haven't done very much traveling in recent years. I've been pretty much based in Canada since we moved here in 2021. So, travel was always a big part of my life before kids. So, yeah, I'm really excited to be there with you in March next year. And I understand that Bob Putnam is one of the headliners there. And I think this may be an opportunity to just go back a few steps and think about some of those kind of founding fathers of thought in this space. During my research, one of the pieces I really resonated with was with a researcher named Nan Lin. And he predicted this revolutionary rise in social capital with the emergence of technology. And his predictions came just a few years before Facebook and LinkedIn were launched, connecting us with everyone we've ever known or worked with. And yet, we haven't necessarily seen the felt experience of connectedness, albeit we have access, but that's not necessarily translating into emotion.
Yeah, technology is an interesting one because it's a tool that can be used to connect, as Madeline predicted, that the opportunity to be able to connect across geographical distances and across time, obviously, is an enormous benefit in terms of building and maintaining social relationships. But at the same time, how we use it maybe actually erodes that sense of connectedness, that like that you're sort of hinting at the emotion side and the depth of the connection that we can form. And so it can be something that can be used very, very positively, or something that actually can create an awful lot of harm as well and actually erode social connection. So in the very short time, really, in the scheme of things that we've been using social media, we haven't yet seemed to have come to a place where we really understand how to make best use of it. And I think the average person probably doesn't use it in a way that is particularly conducive to enhancing their social capital.
Mm, yes, so true. And in my research with 1,218 people leaders here in Canada, we looked at passive versus active use of social media. I believe only 11% were using it actively. So they were commenting, liking, engaging somewhat, whereas another 66% were using it daily and passively. Not in the same study, but I've seen various other studies suggesting that we're spending about 2.5 hours a day on average on social media. So if the majority of that is passive, just imagine like receiving a text message from the same friend or groups of friends and never once replying. And imagine how satisfying or unsatisfying that might feel. And it's starting to understand like what we're doing with our time is, yeah, maybe not serving our greater interests. And in terms of, I mean, you have people doing webinars with you very, very frequently. Um, have you heard any ideas recently that you think, wow, this could really help people either A, understand social capital better, or B, improve how they manage their social capital to make it feel more kind of active in their life?
Yeah, I think some of the key conversations that I've been having recently that are probably most influential for my thinking at the moment came from a recent trip that I did to Chile in South America. I spent 3 weeks traveling around 6 regions and doing lectures and meeting people. And that was organized by Professor Carlos Vignolo. And his approach to social capital is kind of the biology of conversation, where he really explores that we form connection through conversation, but not all conversation forms connection. And so it's certain types of ways in which we communicate with other people that really can form and strengthen and deepen the quality of the connection, and therefore, of course, lead to social capital. And he's come up with this term, obs listening, like a new word, obs listening, observing and listening, because that's the kind of conversation when you observe and listen and you're attentive to other people that allows for the formation of that stronger connection. And so this is something that perhaps people could become more aware of, and they could develop those skills in how to form really meaningful connections. And it's not necessarily just by turning up to a networking event and talking at other people, but it's the types of interactions and connections that are then can foster that really deep sense of connection that is what social capital is all about.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'm definitely going to dig into that a little bit in my own research. Something that's coming up for me is you mentioned networking, and there's people here who are fabulous networkers and they pride themselves on their networking. Personally, I get networked out. And I've had a couple of big events recently, and then at the weekend it was like, no, I can't go somewhere where I'm going to meet a bunch of new people. Like I've met so many new people recently who I want to be able to follow up with, and I can't have the capacity to follow up with new people if I keep meeting new people. So it's almost like there's a critical mass of people that we can like A, have as part of our regular connection circles, and then new connections. And I've heard like many times, when you meet someone new, you need to follow up within 2 days or 3 days. And I now understand it because our capacity for humans in our consciousness is so limited that if we don't follow up within those 2 to 3 days, the likelihood is we will literally never think of that person again because they won't have been retained. So we kind of need to follow up to embed them somewhere in our memory bank. Is there anything there that you've come across before?
Well, again, like we're talking about technology. Technology can help to overcome some of the shortcomings of our memory and our ability to be able to remember the details of relationships as well. So I've heard of people quite literally using paper lists of people's names and some details about them to keep track of the people who they know. But of course, these days with technology, we can use LinkedIn or other kinds of systems to be able to do that. But I think when we think about the overload that can come from meeting new people, I think it depends on how we front up in those situations. Because with all of the travel that I've been doing around the world, I notice when I become a bit overloaded socially and I don't want to meet any more people. And it tends to be when I spend a lot of time in environments that aren't particularly authentic, where it's difficult to be authentic and make authentic connection. But then when I'm in other environments where I'm meeting people and I really can be, honest and vulnerable and really connect with somebody, I don't seem to reach the same kind of level of kind of social fatigue. And I'm able just to keep meeting people and people and people. And it's also much easier to remember those people as well, because when you make an authentic connection with them and you find those commonalities that you have with them, and it's then much easier to remember details about them, and that leaves a much more lasting impression. And so I think the tendency is that if you make kind of short transactional interactions with people, okay, it's very difficult to remember details about them. 2 days later, you're probably going to hardly remember that you even met them at all or anything about them. But if you can form a deep and meaningful connection with them, which does take a little bit longer, of course, and different ways of conversing, following Professor Vignolo's approach, then you can form those kinds of connections that I think are much more meaningful and last quite a lot longer. Like there's people I met on my last trip that I'm sure I'll still remember in years to come. And I'm sure they'll still remember me because we form such a deep connection. And sometimes that can happen really quite quickly when you can open up and express and communicate in a way that can form that connection.
So beautiful. And conversely, do we need to save every single connection we meet, or can we just sometimes take an interaction for what it is? Like back in the day, we wouldn't necessarily take down the home address of everybody that we met so we could send them a Christmas card. We would talk to strangers and we would meet people at events and we'd say, great to connect with you. Bye bye. Are we a bit too obsessed these days with, oh, how can we stay connected? And then we have thousands and thousands of people that we see the updates of that actually we don't have that embedded relationship with.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult one because I say to people, look, in terms of social capital, if you don't come away from the interaction with some sort of way to keep in touch, then you haven't built social capital. But that doesn't mean that you haven't had a meaningful experience in the interaction you've had with them, and it hasn't perhaps fulfilled your social needs and other needs as well. And so I agree with you. Perhaps we don't always need to make it actionable, but if we are interested in building social capital, then we do need to have a way to be able to reconnect or to interact again in future. And so I think it's both at the same time. Like we a lot of people are obsessed with building their social capital, and perhaps that's at the expense of the moment. And we need to probably at sometimes at least just be in the moment and just allow the interaction to occur and to enjoy the benefits of that without trying to make it something else.
Mm. And then sometimes maybe it is at the expense of the close connections that we aren't investing the amount of time that those relationships actually need from us because we're spreading ourselves far and wide. So do we need to sometimes just kind of bring it back and identify those closer connections and find ways that we can have those more deep, meaningful conversations with those people in our life?
Yeah, I think we certainly can spread ourselves too thin. And when we do that, we tend to be, even if you're trying to show up with authenticity, it's difficult when with somebody who's effectively a stranger to really form those kind of deep connections. And if that's all you ever do all day long is just try to meet people and maybe occasionally maintain these distant ties, then you're right. You're not going to be getting what you need from those deeper connections that where there's a long-standing basis of trust and goodwill and reciprocity and that provides different kinds of benefits for you and for them. And so I think it is important to think about the people in your life who you really want to develop those really deep connections with, as well as thinking about how you can just get to know lots of people as well. And when you show up with authenticity, then you can form these quite strong relationships very, very quickly, and they're not terribly expensive in terms of time to maintain as well when you do show up with authenticity.
One of the pieces that I really appreciated from you during my master's research journey, I had read about bonding and bridging social capital through Bowling Alone and the book, but you did a brilliant article where you literally had a diagram and it was bonding, bridging, and it was like all the differences between them. That really helped me. I literally had it on my desk for a while to help me understand that. I wonder if there's a few of those that always resonate with people that you'd be willing to share with us today.
Yeah, that table, that was interesting. I produced that table because I was seeing bonding and bridging referred to in very different kinds of ways, and I wanted to try and compile it and say, look, this is all of the different ways in which it's understood. And some of them are very complementary or very similar to each other, but some of them are actually quite different. And so when you approach bonding and bridging with the different understanding to something else, then the meaning changes quite a bit, I think. And so it highlights in some ways the similarities between the different ways of thinking about bonding bridging, as well as the differences as well. But at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is we're trying to categorize different types of relationships based on effectively the closeness that we have with that person. And so it's coming back to what we were talking about just a moment ago, where if all we ever did was try to build these kind of weak, distant ties with people, then we'd only ever have bridging, and it would only ever be able to provide certain kinds of benefits and opportunities for our in our lives. Whereas we need the bonding as well. We need the stronger ties. We need to form those deeper relationships as well. And I think that's probably the easiest way to think about the kind of difference between bonding and bridging, going beyond all of the academic kind of ways of thinking about it.
One of the questions in my research study, which kind of really speaks to the bonding, was how many people do you feel at ease discussing private matters with? And it was really interesting. We broke it down to geographically close friends and then friends further than 30 minutes away, relatives, and then professional connections. And of the 1,218 respondents, the numbers were so small. Like I think averaged out, it was about 10 per person they felt comfortable discussing private matters with. And yeah, it was so interesting to me because we live in a society where we think we need to have so many friends and connections, yet really for our social health, we need these very close connections that we do feel comfortable being vulnerable with, having that reciprocity with, appreciating, making time to appreciate them. And those numbers can be really small. And I think when I worked with this group of people leaders at a financial services firm, when I translated those findings to them, some of the leaders that felt that they were lonely, when they understood kind of the average, it kind of shifted their thinking in that, oh, I've got that. Like I've got these people around me in these different areas or facets of my life. And that knowing, as well as kind of working with them through the program, that awareness really helped them to kind of shift along that conceptual continuum that I developed into a much more safe zone, into the social well-being, or what I described as social wealth. So yeah, helping people to understand that our bonding ties, they might not be expansive. You might need to kind of keep them in. You don't need to shed every layer of the onion with every single person that you meet. So we can be a bit more selective with who we share our kind of real personal life with. On that note, yeah, I wonder if I know we had quite a good debate on your webinar about the difference of social wealth and social capital. I wonder if that's come up for you since, or if you've had any thoughts on the difference of between social capital and social wealth, if indeed there is.
Yeah, I think it's worth exploring what the difference might be. But I think coming back to the idea that we need lots and lots of people who are really, really close in our lives. I think we need to acknowledge that everybody is different and they have different needs for social connection. I've certainly known people who are really quite happy kind of being on their own as long as they've got somebody around, maybe even just one person who they can confide in and they can get that kind of support from. Whereas other people feel like they need two or three or four. And often maybe it's the perception as well, like you said, like they might be like, I only really have two people who are close friends, but and that's not enough. But well, why isn't it enough? And just reconnecting with that and coming to terms with how many people you actually need to have in your life. But also the fact that because so many people are kind of afraid or scared or reluctant to share personal details with other people, this could be a perception as well that other people are not trustworthy or that they might be judged or whatever it might be. And so just helping people to understand that you can be, authentic and honest without necessarily exposing vulnerability that could become a problem for you, and finding a way of being in relationships and a way of communicating where you can be more authentic. And by doing so, then you perhaps can develop more of these kinds of relationships. And like we've been talking about, it's really a continuum. Some people in your life are going to be incredibly strong, close connections, and other people maybe not quite so much. And then, of course, you've got your very weak or distant ties. And so just finding ways in order to turn up in those relationships and try sharing a bit more detail about yourself and your personal life. People's reluctance perhaps is because they're afraid to do so, and maybe that this is something that they could overcome by practicing. And it's the things like, again, coming back to Professor Vignolo's obs listening, that kind of approach. If people around you were practicing that kind of observing and listening without judgment kind of practice, then people are going to feel much more comfortable with sharing personal details about themselves, because they're not going to feel like they're going to be judged and there's going to be negative consequences for it. So I don't think I've answered your question at all about the difference between social capital and social wealth.
No, that's okay. Well, maybe I'll introduce kind of my thoughts through it. So I kind of really started by researching the topic of loneliness in a professional context, particularly. And then that led me into learning about the work of Professor Corey Keyes and social well-being and the 5 kind of areas of social well-being that he identified. Um, but it just felt to me like this language wasn't necessarily resonating with professionals. Social capital had been on my radar for some time, but personally, the term doesn't do anything for me physiologically. I understand it, but it just doesn't do anything. And as soon as I heard the term social wealth, I was like, that I get. And as I kind of delved more into the research of it, I began to see that social wealth was kind of the end of that continuum. And the way that it slots in is that loneliness is an emotion, social well-being is an emotion, and which is completely subjective based on your social needs. And again, social wealth in that continuum is how socially wealthy you feel. So it's not necessarily what you have access to in terms of the social capital. You could have access and be extremely well networked and have people that would support you in a multitude of ways. But if you're not activating it, then you're not going to be feeling socially wealthy. So, like for me, someone that moved overseas during the pandemic, my global social capital is extremely high. I've lived, worked, and traveled on 3 continents, and I have a lot of connections all over the place. I didn't in Canada. We came here where we didn't have any connections really. And so I have all this kind of dormant social capital, and I wasn't activating it virtually. For me at that time, going onto social media kind of made me feel worse. It made me feel like, oh, all these people that I used to, have in my life, and now I just can see their lives, but they're not, it didn't feel like they were part of my life. And I have done quite a lot of work over the last few years to activate those connections, even if they're not on the same continent as me, by inviting them into spaces and feeling like we know things of each other and we are able to share our life again. And it's been a beautiful journey because we don't pick up the phone to tell each other things anymore. You need the instigators to create spaces to invite people in. And being that instigator, as much as it's appreciated, can feel extremely vulnerable. So I will get off my monologue and pass over to you to just, yeah, I'd love to understand if social wealth is a kind of term or phrase that you're finding yourself perhaps using a bit more of these days. Is it resonating with people in different ways? Like, what's your experience of it?
Yeah, I think it's worth talking about social capital and the capital ideology that's attached to it, because it isn't very intuitive. Like, we think about social connection and relationships, but then when we start applying the word capital to that, it sounds kind of strange. And it may be a little bit offensive almost, that we're like exploiting or taking advantage of other people. But the real reason I think why there's so much interest in social capital, and there has been over the last 30 or 40 years, and there's just absolutely exploding in terms of its popularity, is because it meets the modern system where it is, where the modern system, our culture, is very much focused on capital. And even though we're then applying that to social relationships, it's still, it highlights, it prioritizes, it makes us think about social relationships in a different kind of way. But I think the challenge that we've had is that up until now, we've really focused about the instrumental benefits that we can individually get from having social capital. And even when we're talking about collective benefits, we're still talking really about these kind of instrumental benefits. You can get a job, or you can be more prepared for a disaster, and so forth. And these are obviously very important outcomes that come from being socially connected, but it isn't really what drives social connection in the first place. And perhaps that's why a term like social wealth or social connection or social cohesion is a little bit more appealing to people who have a problem with the term capital, is because it implies more of those social needs being met. But the thing is that when you actually explore the way in which social capital functions, it functions because social needs are met. And the job introduction or the recommendation or the loaning or giving or sharing, whatever it might be, these are all secondary outcomes that occur when social needs are met. And so I need to explain this a little bit more, because this might sound like a little bit of a foreign concept for people who are interested in the concept of social capital. Because when you think about, you and I, for example, we have social capital. And if you were to help me with something, why would you do that? You would do it because your social needs are being met by helping me, because you would feel validated, or you would feel, like you're living up to your higher self. Like, if your social needs are met, then you would help me. And then I would benefit as a result of that. Maybe you introduce me to a client or whatever it might be. But it only occurs because your social needs are being met in the first place. Otherwise, the social capital doesn't occur at all. So what is being activated in you is that the nature of our relationship, how you feel about me, what you think about me, that is being activated when you decide to help me with something. And so we don't tend to think about this when we're thinking about social capital. Almost all of the academic literature is very much focused on these kind of instrumental benefits that occur, rather than the social needs, the connection and the fulfillment that occurs through social relationships. And so the benefit of social capital as a concept is that it allows us to understand the process that results in the outcomes that we're interested in. And that process, using capital logic and so forth, that can allow us to really understand the mechanisms that are at play and the reasons why people do the things that they do that lead to those outcomes. And that's much more explored in capital logic than it is just with the concept of, say, social connection. Social connection is important, yeah, but how does that function to produce the kind of outcomes that we're interested in? And I see that's the benefit of the capital framing with social capital.
I think this knowledge is so needed, because there's certain things, like I will often feel the impulse to do something, to bring a group together, and maybe 2 out of 10 times I'll actually do it. So we can't follow through and do everything. But whenever I do, something happens, like something comes out of it. So, an example, in the summer, there was a lot of family fun days happening all around, but I'm like, well, I already know quite a lot of families. Like, maybe we could do our own little family fun day. So I put a message out to a few local mums and said, fancy doing a private family fun day? Would your family be interested? And straight away I got a message back from one mum to say, yes, love it. Should we go for a coffee and talk it through? Went for a coffee. There was a beautiful weekend coming up, great weather. So we're like, well, let's just choose a day that weekend. Let's choose a space that has washrooms and we'll bring some families together. So it took so little effort because somebody else was up for helping. We just arranged kind of games to bring, put it out there, and 6 families came and joined us. Really easy. A couple of days later, I had a call from one of the mums to say, I've got a last minute box ticket to go and see Bush in concert. Would you like to tonight? Do you want to come? And I was like, yes, of course I do. And there was 6 other mums, not the same group, but the one that invited me, she is extremely well networked. She's from here, so she has a lot of friends and connections. Would she have invited me if I hadn't put on a family fun day? Maybe. Probably not though, because I just wouldn't have been on her consciousness. But I'd gone a little bit out of my way to put on a family fun day. I didn't do it to get anything back. I did it because I needed it for my own sanity. And it was great fun. We played with the kids for about an hour and then they warmed up and we didn't see them again for another 2 hours. So we were able to actually have some conversations with other families. And I guess I'm just saying this because I'd love for this to incentivize others who potentially have those impulses to bring people together to gather, and then they think of all the reasons why they shouldn't do it. So it's just to say, like, follow through with one of them. Don't do all of them because that's impossible. But yes, put yourself out there a bit and understand that it might feel vulnerable. And if it does, like, just remember pressure is a privilege and that you've got people that you can invite. How wonderful is that? And who knows, something might come off the back of you going above and beyond what you need to do to bring people together.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the possible benefits of a concept like social capital is that it helps people to reconnect with the value and importance of relationships, because it's easy just to sit on the couch and scroll Facebook and or just watch TV, and that's not very productive. It's just really quite consumptive, and it's easy and it's very passive. But when we connect with the importance and value, and you describe it in the way that you did, it's very obvious just how beneficial that is. But we also understand that relationships can be messy and things can go wrong, and sometimes it can be difficult, but it's worth it when you reconnect with the value and importance that it gives us and our communities as well. And so I think that's kind of the point with the concept like of social capital, is that it gives us a way to talk about the importance and value, and hopefully people start getting off the couch and doing those kinds of things, because we used to, in modern societies, and this has been very well documented by Bob Putnam's work on associations, we used to be joiners, we used to be active, we used to do things and produce and connect, but we don't so much anymore. And I think the main reason why we don't so much anymore comes down to probably a whole lot of things. But top of the list for me is just how busy we are and how much information there is and how overloaded we are. By the end of the day, a lot of people, they just want to sit on the couch. They just want to switch off and go into that consumptive mode of scrolling Facebook or watching TV or something. And it takes some effort to do something else, but we feel a bit overloaded and like, I'm not prepared to do something else today. I just want comfort and security and familiarity rather than the potential messiness and difficulty and challenges that come from social interaction. But again, if we can use the concept of social capital to remind people of how valuable and important that is, then maybe we'll get more people getting off the couch and doing those kinds of things. Because like you said, like when you do it, you realize just how fun it is in the moment and just how many other great things tend to stem from it as well going forward.
Mm. Something that's coming up for me when you say that is on the research that I did in the quant part of it, when I asked these people leaders how many groups or communities they belong to, both online and offline, the quant figures were extremely low. So when I went into the in-depth interviews with 13 of the leaders, I asked the question again. Um, and initially they'd be like, sometimes none. But then I'd be like, what about your friendship groups? And they'd be like, ah. So it's like asking a question about groups and communities. For some of them, didn't they thought civic groups or communities, friendship, and I think we even mentioned friendship including friendship group in the quant design, but even in the qualitative, like that wasn't something that immediately came to mind. So what came through is for these people leaders who are very busy in work and often very involved in work, extracurricular wise outside of their job role, they don't necessarily have capacity for civic groups outside of work, but friendship groups are extremely important, particularly those very long lasting friendship groups, maybe from university or whatever. Yeah, that was a really curious finding for me, that we don't necessarily think of these groups as a group that we belong to.
Yeah. And this is something I think that Bob found in his research on community and associations, that people are bowling in leagues less, but they're not necessarily bowling less because they're still showing up with their friends. They're just not necessarily interacting and participating in these more organized events and therefore meeting people outside of their friend groups. And there seems to be a pattern that's going on everywhere. And so it's something that perhaps we could be more aware of, is and try and break down those barriers that people have about joining an association or meeting people who are different than themselves, is that familiarity of just showing up with your friends. But then the other thing that this really, I think, is really striking is that most people are very unaware of how much social capital they actually have. So I find the same sort of thing. You ask people, well, where do you belong? Like, where are your groups? And they don't think about all of the ones that you'd think would be quite obvious, like that perhaps they're a member of the church. But yeah, but I'm not a member. I just show up on a Sunday. Yeah, but you're still part of that community. You still show up and participate in it, but they don't think about that. And then they don't also think about all of the connections they have there that they could activate, they could mobilize, then they could connect with in a more significant kind of way. And you find people forgetting the sporting teams that they're part of because, oh no, that's not a group that I'm a part of. No, I just turn up and play sport. Yeah, but you're part of a team, and that the same thing. They don't think about and they don't realize that these are all relationships that could be activated, that could be mobilized, that they could form deeper relationships with. And so the average person, I think, is very unaware of just how much social capital they have. They forget about their uncles and aunts and their cousins and all of the people who are in their lives. They just forget about and they don't realize that they have all of these connections, and they just perhaps they think about it. And there's been great research done on this, looking at how people's networks change very rapidly over time because people tend to only think about the people who they've had contact with very recently as people who are in their lives. But of course, when you think deeper, you realize just how many people there are that you don't necessarily have contact with all the time.
And something that came to me when I was doing my research was about parasocial relationships. So these were typically, they're known as one-way relationships. So you know something about them. Maybe it's a radio DJ or a Hollywood star. You know about their life through seeing them in movies and reading magazines. They don't know of you. And I really felt that we have so many more parasocial relationships these days with social media, especially if we're not actively putting ourselves out there very frequently. So we know everything that's going on in the lives of many people that we used to be in a relationship with, and we're not anymore, but they know nothing of us. So in terms of our consciousness and our capacity, they might be on our mind every now and then, but we are nowhere in their mind because they don't know what we're doing. Has anything of that come to you in terms of social capital?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting phenomenon because people who have, are in, particularly people who are in positions where they have a lot of exposure, they effectively find it very, very easy to build social capital for exactly the reason that you described, because people already know them. There's a familiarity there that they have. And there's a pretty strong cognitive bias as well, the familiarity bias, where just simply being aware of somebody generally gives you positive interpretations of them, unless there's reasons, of course, to think negatively about them. And so people in those positions find it very easy to build social capital. Whereas people who are unknown and nobody knows them, of course, they've just like everybody else, they perhaps struggle to form social capital. But of course, the nature of the social capital that's built isn't necessarily authentic because of that bias. You know somebody, you think you know about them, but of course you don't. You've just seen them on television, for example. It's not the same as actually getting to know them. That you don't necessarily have that kind of connection with them in any kind of way because you're not seeing necessarily the real them as well. So I think it's an interesting dynamic that can be created. Particularly, you see it within organizations where the senior leadership tends to be in that kind of position. Everybody knows them, but then the junior people, nobody tends to know. And it plays out in the same kind of way.
Thank you for bringing this into the workplace. Yeah. And I think a lot of companies are trying to get around that and being quite creative, particularly remote first companies, I would say, because people haven't got the opportunities to get to know each other in the cafeteria as they used to. So, yeah, certain things like I believe Microsoft does a own your failure session where the most senior person in the room has to go first. So they describe a time when they failed at work somehow, and then they kind of go around and all learn something from someone else's failure. So helps to really kind of build that connection, trust internally.
Like one of the things that's often missing from the literature on social capital is that a lot of the opportunities for social action come from knowing about other people, not necessarily by having trust or reciprocity, and those things are obviously important as well, but the opportunities often stem from simply knowing. So, for example, I'm a software developer. I've been doing that for years as a bit of a hobby, and I'm quite good at it. You didn't know that about me, I assume, until now. But now that you do know, there's opportunities could arise where I could help you with something. And similarly, if when I find more out about you, then similarly we can identify opportunities where I might be able to benefit from something and we might be able to act together on something. And so a lot of the opportunities come from knowing. And if we don't know about other people, then we don't know what how we could work together and how we might be able to tap into each other's expertise and knowledge. And it's something that organizations are kind of aware of, but it's something they could do a lot better. And those kinds of activities often are designed, maybe not designed for it, but they have the consequence of or the outcome of people getting to know more about each other and therefore being able to identify those kinds of opportunities.
Yeah, and like employee-led lunch and learn sessions or, internal informal TED Talks, that kind of thing where people get up and talk about an obscure topic that you never knew that they were into. Yeah, how valuable those kind of things. And those kind of things can obviously be done in person or virtually these days as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. And again, technology can kind of enhance that as well, because that's kind of the purpose of things like bios and directories is it lists those kinds of details. And as long as people engage with them, then you can find out a lot more about people. And ideally, it's those things that are a bit not necessarily specifically related to the job or role description that often are the most beneficial in terms of identifying those opportunities that are outside of the norm.
So, as well as academics, who else are you expecting to be coming to the Social Capital Conference in Dubai? In case this speaks to someone that's listening here.
It's kind of an academic conference, but we have quite a lot of people who run some sort of a social impact enterprise or a community-based organization of some kind as well. People who are working in policy in various kinds of areas, whether it's within organizations or whether it's within public health or whatever it might be. And so we really want to connect across I guess, what is it, effectively a divide between academia and people who are putting it in practice and using it in policy and in strategy, and to have those conversations across all of those areas. So we're expecting it to be probably about maybe 70 or 80% academics, but then hopefully a lot of other people will show up as well to learn from the academics and to be able to share their input as well and have those interesting conversations.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm just kind of, my mind's drawing back to your mammoth trip that you've had this year. You spoke a little about being in Chile. I wonder if there's another highlight from this trip, maybe somebody that you met or someone, a place that you went that kind of helped to shift your thinking and deepen kind of that knowing of the importance of social capital.
Well, I think the most striking was in one of the central areas of Chile around the Bio region, Nuble region, where they're building a new hospital, and they're using the opportunity of moving from the old hospital to the new one to really implement a social capital approach throughout the health system. So all the way from the way in which the patients engage and interact, as well as the staff and the way that they engage and interact. And I think around the world, we're seeing a huge amount of interest in the impacts that social connection can have on health outcomes, as well as a whole lot of other areas, of course. But I think that kind of case where they're spending a huge amount of money on a brand new state-of-the-art hospital, but they're also so focused on the way in which people connect within that space and within that organization. I think it's really inspiring to see that kind of thing happening.
Well, Tristan, it's been a honor to have you here and um, to hopefully help a few more people understand what social capital is and how they can build and activate this in their lives. Um, I wonder if there's just something that we haven't touched on today that is really kind of present in your mind right now that you feel called to share.
Yeah, I think coming back to the idea that capital is exploitive, when you start to reconnect with how social capital functions, you realize that that's impossible for it to function in that way. Because if you try to exploit somebody, then you leave behind no capital, no benefit, nothing that can be activated in future. So social capital only works when you're giving, when you're caring, when you're effectively fulfilling social needs and you're building something. That's the only way that it functions. And so for anyone who thinks that social capital is exploitive, we'll just connect with that fact that you can't possibly build it and it can't function if you try to exploit others. And so it really is about creating that authentic connection and being giving and sharing without expectation of return, because that's what builds the capital.
Yes. So let's add value to the connections in our life. On that note, I will thank you for being with me and spending your time with me today. And I wish you every success going into the 2026 year. And I really look forward to meeting you in person in March.
Thanks very much, Shelley. It's been a real pleasure.